The Americans built machines that could watch everything. The British trained men who could understand anything. In southern Afghanistan, only one of those turned conversations into targets. The file was classified, UK eyes only, buried for years. But the moment it described was simple. A British operator sitting on a carpet in a village outside Sangin, surrounded by tribal elders, listening to a language he had no right to understand, as well as he did, and realizing that one man in the room did not belong. Warrant Officer Daniel Marsden had been given 6 weeks to learn Pashto. Not fluency, not mastery, just enough to survive and catch what others would miss. 14 hours a day in Hereford, no English allowed, constant repetition until the sounds started making sense. And by deployment he could follow most conversations if they stayed predictable, which in Helmand they rarely did. But he didn't need perfection. He needed speed. And in that room, speed mattered more than accuracy. The meeting followed the usual structure: long greetings, deliberate respect, slow pacing, and Marsden handled them in Pashto. Names, honorifics, details pulled from briefings. And that alone shifted the room, because instead of another foreign officer behind an interpreter, they saw someone speaking directly, correctly, without hesitation. And the effect was immediate. Tension eased, voices dropped, attention sharpened. The formal discussion began: security, crops, complaints, and the interpreter translated every word. But Marsden wasn't focused on that because the real conversation wasn't happening there. It was in fragments, whispers between elders, short exchanges that never reached translation, tone shifts that changed meaning completely, and that was where the truth lived. He picked up patterns quickly, 3 men aligning responses too precisely, adjusting through quiet comments, one elder checking a phone under his clothing and feeding information into the discussion, and one man who didn't fit. Late arrival, no match in the briefing, addressed differently. His Pashto carrying a southern cadence that didn't belong in Helmand, Kandahar, not local, and that alone meant nothing. Until he heard a phrase, short, religious, specific, something flagged before as a Taliban internal marker, the kind of detail no machine would catch and no interpreter would highlight. Marsden didn't react, not outwardly. Instead, he leaned forward, asked a routine question, kept the flow steady, then a few minutes later told a joke, one drilled into him during training, and it landed. The elders laughed, the room relaxed further, and the man he was watching laughed too, but just slightly too late, enough to confirm he was adjusting, not responding naturally. And that delay mattered. Marsden stayed for the full meeting, over 3 hours, building a picture from behavior, not statements, who deferred to whom, who avoided eye contact, who influenced without speaking directly, and by the end he wasn't guessing. He had identified a connector, someone linking conversations without owning them, far more valuable than a visible commander. When the shura closed, he completed the departure in Pashto. Full sequence, farewells, blessings, handshakes done correctly, because that mattered as much as anything else. And then he walked out with something no surveillance platform could provide: context, fragile but precise. And that context became intelligence. The unknown man led to a number. The number led to contacts. The contacts mapped a pattern across villages south of Nad Ali. And within weeks a target emerged. Not a fighter, but a coordinator, holding relationships together. 3 weeks later, helicopters moved before dawn. The compound isolated, breached, secured in minutes, the target captured alive, Documents recovered, money seized, no British casualties, efficient, controlled, almost routine, because the raid itself wasn't the story. Any capable unit could have done that. The story was the conversation that made it possible. At the same time, American forces across Afghanistan were running operations at a completely different scale, thousands of missions, vast intelligence networks, drones tracking movement across entire regions, signals intercepted, processed, analyzed, turned into action through a system that defined modern warfare. And it worked, but it worked differently. Where the British built targets through interaction, the Americans built them through data, and data needed processing. That processing created delay, and delay created distance. On the ground, conversations passed through interpreters, tone softened, intent filtered, context reduced, and in a conflict where meaning mattered more than words, that gap was enough. The Taliban adapted quickly, shaping how they spoke in front of foreign forces. With Americans, they could manage perception, adjust narratives, because there was always a layer between speaker and listener. But the British reduced that layer. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Operators like Marsden didn't replace interpreters. They gained verification, the ability to hear something and know when it didn't match, to catch fragments outside the main discussion, to act immediately instead of waiting. And that immediacy changed the tempo. A radio intercept understood in seconds instead of hours, a comment overheard and acted on instantly. Small pieces combining faster, because they didn't need to be processed first. And it wasn't about knowing everything, it was about knowing enough, fast enough. The Taliban noticed they had adapted to drones, to surveillance. But this was different, human and harder to counter. And in their communications, they began to distinguish between forces by language, not equipment. The Americans could be managed, influenced, delayed, but the British were something else. They used a phrase, not exact in translation, but clear enough. Those who hear, and it wasn't respect, it was a warning. Don't speak freely. Don't assume you are not understood. Don't rely on translation to protect you, because sometimes there is no barrier at all, and that changed behavior. Conversations shorter, more cautious, trust narrower, information moving slower inside their own networks, and in a system built on constant communication, even small disruptions mattered. Marsden didn't need perfect Pashto. He needed to recognize when something mattered and act before the moment passed. And that was the difference. Not better weapons, not better technology, but timing. Because in Helmand, the gap between hearing something and acting on it was the difference between finding a target and becoming one. The first time it worked in the field, it didn't look important. No raid, no helicopters, no target package, just 4 men moving through compounds north of Musa Qala. Routine clearance in a place where routine didn't exist. The patrol carried an ICOM scanner, standard equipment, usually just background noise, Pashto chatter recorded, and sent away for translation hours later. But this time, one man understood what he was hearing. 2 voices, short transmission, one giving directions, the other confirming, no coordinates, just reference points, rooftops, walls, irrigation lines, and within seconds it was enough. 4 British soldiers moving south. Observed, confirmed, waiting. That last word mattered. It meant the ambush wasn't set yet, just forming. He didn't wait, didn't pass it up the chain. He moved immediately, stopped the patrol, redirected behind a mud wall barely high enough to cover them, broke the line of sight. 90 seconds later, the bearing was confirmed. 2 minutes after the intercept, they had identified the observer's position. The ambush never happened. Under the old system, that transmission would have taken hours to process. By then, it would have been too late. 2 minutes instead of 2 hours changed everything. It wasn't just survival. It was control. For the first time, they were acting inside the same timeline as the enemy. The Taliban spoke, and someone understood instantly. That compressed the battlefield in a way technology couldn't. Information was no longer delayed or filtered. It was immediate. Patrols adapted quickly. Radio chatter stopped being background noise and became live intelligence, something to act on in the moment. Not perfectly, not without risk, but fast enough to matter. And speed in Helmand was everything. The Taliban noticed. Their communication system had always relied on simplicity, cheap radios, short range, no encryption, but it worked because it depended on delay. They assumed intercepted speech would take time to translate. That assumption began to collapse. Instructions started circulating, not about avoiding drones, but about how to speak. Keep it short. Avoid specifics. Don't describe positions directly. It wasn't a reaction to surveillance. It was a reaction to understanding. Once the enemy understands you in real time, your language becomes a weakness. The change wasn't uniform. Some units adapted, others didn't. Habits stayed. Discipline varied. But the pattern was clear. Conversations became shorter, more cautious, less detailed. That caution slowed everything down. Information moved less freely. Trust narrowed. And in a network built on constant communication, even small delays mattered. British signals units had always been intercepting these transmissions, but before they were passive, recorded and processed later. Now they became active. Operators could hear something and act before it disappeared into a system. That immediacy didn't just improve response time, it changed what information mattered. A fragment that would be useless hours later became critical in seconds. It also exposed a deeper weakness: interpreters. Every force relied on them, and they were essential, but they added a layer that couldn't be fully controlled. Not because they were disloyal, but because they were human. They filtered without meaning to, adjusted tone, softened statements, sometimes removed details that felt dangerous to repeat. In one documented case, an interpreter working with coalition forces had been altering translations for months, not out of intent to deceive, but out of fear, removing criticism, avoiding direct accusations, reshaping conversations into something safer. The intelligence wasn't false, but it wasn't complete, and incomplete information led to flawed decisions. The British faced the same risk, but with a difference. Operators who understood even part of the language could hear enough to recognize when something didn't align. Not every word, not every sentence, but enough to detect a gap. And once a gap is detected, everything changes. Meetings stopped being simple exchanges and became layered environments. The official conversation, translated and controlled, was only part of what mattered. The real information existed around it, in whispers, side remarks, tone shifts, small comments never intended for translation. Operators who understood Pashto could track those layers at the same time. In one meeting near Kajaki, an elder publicly supported cooperation while quietly telling his neighbor it didn't matter, that the foreigners would leave eventually. The interpreter delivered the first statement perfectly. The second never reached him. Without language, that contradiction would have remained invisible. With it, it became a warning. These moments weren't dramatic. No immediate firefight. No instant result. But over time, they built a deeper understanding. Not just who was speaking, but what they meant. That difference fed directly into targeting. The Taliban wasn't a conventional force. It was a network, held together by relationships, tribal, financial, personal, and maintained through communication. Disrupting it required understanding those connections, not just identifying individuals. Language made those connections visible. Patterns began to appear. Certain phrases linked to specific groups. Dialects revealing origins that didn't match claims. Religious expressions tied to internal structures. None of it decisive alone, but together it formed a map no drone could produce. That map led to targets. Not instantly, not perfectly, but consistently enough to matter. Operations based on that intelligence moved differently. Slower at the start, faster at the end. More precise. Fewer unknowns at the point of contact. The contrast with the American system became clearer. Their scale was unmatched, more assets, more coverage, more data, but their process required analysis before action. Collection, processing, verification. Powerful, but slower. The British approach reduced that delay in specific moments. Not everywhere, not always, but when it worked, it created something different. An operator hears something, understands enough, and acts immediately. No delay, no translation queue, no second layer. The Taliban recognized that difference. Their communications began to reflect it. Warnings spread, not about drones or surveillance, but about language. Don't speak freely when the British are near. They understand. Change your words. Avoid clarity. It was an attempt to adapt, but adaptation came with cost. Every layer of caution reduced efficiency. Messages became less clear. Coordination slowed. Mistakes increased. In a system that depended on speed and trust, that friction mattered. The British didn't need to intercept everything. They just needed to apply enough pressure that the system began to strain. And once it did, the advantage shifted. Because in Helmand, the fight wasn't decided by resources alone. It was decided by who understood faster, who could act inside the same moment instead of reacting later. Language didn't replace technology, but it changed the timing of everything. And in that environment, timing was the difference between control and chaos. By early 2008, the difference was no longer theoretical. It was visible in how operations unfolded across Helmand, especially around Gereshk. British Special Forces were running fewer missions than their American counterparts, but their success rate at the point of contact was higher, and more importantly, their targets were cleaner. The system wasn't driven by volume, it was driven by understanding. And understanding in this environment came from something most people treated as secondary: language. Traditional intelligence followed a layered process: collection, analysis, verification, dissemination, execution. Each step added time, and time created distance between observation and action. Signals were intercepted, recorded, translated, passed through analysts, compared against other data, and only then turned into something usable. It was thorough, but slow. The British approach cut through that structure in specific moments. When an operator could hear and understand enough in real time, the cycle collapsed. There was no waiting for translation, No delay for confirmation through multiple channels. Just recognition, interpretation, and action. That compression changed outcomes. Patrols could react to threats before they fully developed. Intercepts that would normally sit in a queue for hours became immediate indicators of movement, intent, or positioning. Not everything was clear, and not everything needed to be, but enough information in the right moment was enough to act. In Helmand, that difference mattered more than perfect intelligence delivered too late. The Taliban adapted quickly once they realized this gap. Their communication style shifted. Messages became shorter, less descriptive, more coded. They avoided specifics, reduced identifiable details, and relied more on shared understanding within their networks. It wasn't a reaction to drones or surveillance in general. It was a reaction to the realization that someone, somewhere, could understand them immediately. That forced a change in behavior. And behavior change introduced friction. Friction slowed everything. Orders took longer to pass. Coordination became more cautious. Mistakes increased. In a system that depended on trust and speed, that slowdown had consequences. The British didn't need to intercept everything. They only needed to disrupt the flow enough to create uncertainty. Once uncertainty entered the system, decisions became harder, slower, less reliable. At the same time, the role of interpreters, long considered essential, became more complicated. Every coalition force relied on them, but they introduced a layer of mediation that couldn't be fully controlled. Not because they were untrustworthy, but because they were human. They interpreted tone, softened statements, sometimes omitted details that felt too sensitive to translate directly. In some cases, this was intentional. In others, it was instinctive. But the result was the same. Information was slightly altered between speaker and listener. That slight alteration mattered. There were documented cases where interpreters working with coalition forces adjusted translations in ways that changed the perception of an entire conversation. Not falsifying, but shaping. Removing emphasis. Reordering meaning. What reached the receiving side wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete. And incomplete intelligence can lead to flawed conclusions. The British approach partially countered that risk. Operators with even limited Pashto capability could detect inconsistencies between what was said and what was translated. They didn't need full fluency. They only needed enough understanding to recognize when something didn't align. That awareness changed how they approached engagements. Meetings became layered environments. On the surface, there was the formal conversation, translated, structured, expected. Beneath it, there were side conversations, tone shifts, subtle signals between individuals that didn't always reach translation. Operators who could understand the language could track both layers at once. They could hear what was being said to them and what was being said around them. In places like Kajaki, this created a significant advantage. In one recorded engagement, an elder publicly expressed cooperation with coalition forces while privately dismissing their long-term presence in a side conversation. The interpreter translated the public statement correctly. The private comment never reached the official record. Without language, the contradiction would have gone unnoticed. With it, it became a signal, an indication of underlying sentiment that didn't match surface-level cooperation. These moments didn't always lead to immediate action. Often they accumulated over time. patterns began to form. Certain phrases associated with specific groups, dialect variations that indicated origin outside a claimed area, religious references tied to particular networks. None of these elements were decisive on their own, but together they created a picture that didn't exist in any single report or image. That picture became the foundation for targeting. The Taliban didn't operate like a conventional army. It wasn't organized into fixed units with clear hierarchies and defined positions. It functioned as a network, flexible, adaptive, and built on relationships. Disrupting that network required understanding how those relationships were structured. Language provided access to that structure. It revealed connections that weren't visible through surveillance alone. When a target emerged from that process, it wasn't because of a single piece of evidence. It was because of convergence, multiple indicators, speech patterns, communication behavior, observed interactions, pointing toward the same conclusion. Once that level of confidence was reached, operations could be planned with greater precision. Those operations were more efficient, not necessarily more frequent, but more effective at the point of execution. Fewer unknowns, better identification, cleaner outcomes. Compared to larger-scale systems, especially those used by forces like the United States, the difference was in approach rather than capability. The American model emphasized scale, more sensors, more coverage, more data. It was designed to see as much as possible. But that also meant more information to process before action could be taken. The British approach didn't attempt to see everything. It focused on understanding what mattered in the moment. That distinction became most visible during operations targeting network facilitators, individuals who weren't frontline fighters, but who connected different parts of the system. Identifying them required more than observation. It required interpretation of behavior, speech, and interaction. Language made that possible. By 2008, Taliban communications began reflecting that shift. Internal warnings circulated advising caution when speaking near coalition forces. Use fewer details. Avoid explicit references. Be careful with language. It wasn't a complete adaptation, but it was enough to introduce hesitation. And hesitation slowed the network. Every system has limits. Language-based intelligence wasn't perfect. Misinterpretations still occurred. Dialects could be misunderstood. Context could be misread. In at least one case, an incorrectly interpreted transmission led to an operation against a location that had no confirmed insurgent activity. It was a mistake, one that required debriefing and adjustment, but it highlighted the importance of balance. Language was a powerful tool, but it had to be used alongside other forms of intelligence, not as a replacement. Still, when it worked, the impact was clear. It reduced delay, it improved targeting, it exposed patterns that would otherwise remain hidden. Most importantly, it allowed operators to act within the same moment as the information they were receiving. And in a conflict where timing defined outcomes, that ability was decisive. Because in Helmand, the difference between hearing something and acting on it wasn't just a matter of seconds or minutes. It was the difference between control and chaos. By 2009, the war in Helmand had not ended, but it had changed shape. Around Helmand province, the patterns were no longer defined only by firefights or territory. They were defined by information. Who had it? Who understood it? And who could act on it first? British units had become known, quietly, within certain circles, not for their size or firepower, but for something less visible, their ability to understand what others missed. It wasn't something that could be easily explained to higher command. Reports didn't fully capture it. Metrics couldn't isolate it cleanly. But in after-action reviews, in patterns of successful engagements, in reduced ambiguity at the point of contact, the effect was there. Language had become a force multiplier, not because it replaced other systems, but because it enhanced them at the exact moment they mattered most. On the ground, operators continued to rely on a combination of signals, surveillance, and human interaction. But now, when something was heard in real time, whether through intercepted radio traffic, overheard conversation, or direct engagement, it didn't have to pass through multiple layers before becoming relevant. It could be acted on immediately. That shift didn't eliminate risk, but it changed how risk was managed. In one case, during a joint patrol near Lashkar Gah, a brief intercepted exchange revealed movement that didn't match expected patterns. Two voices, short, direct, mentioning timing and direction without full context. To an untrained ear, it would have been background noise. To someone who understood the language, it indicated coordination. Not fully formed, not yet executed, but in motion. That was enough. The patrol adjusted its route, avoided the area, and later it was confirmed that the original path would have led into a prepared engagement. These weren't dramatic headline events. They rarely were. The impact of language in this context was cumulative. Small adjustments, small decisions. Over time, those decisions added up to measurable differences in outcomes. The Taliban continued to adapt. Their communications became more guarded, more fragmented. They relied increasingly on indirect references, shared context, and assumptions within trusted circles. This made their network more secure, but also less efficient. Information took longer to move. Messages required more interpretation. That slowed coordination across regions. It didn't break the network, but it introduced friction, and friction reduces effectiveness. At the same time, coalition forces were also learning, not just about the enemy, but about themselves. The introduction of language capability at the operational level forced a shift in how intelligence was valued. It wasn't just about what could be collected, but about what could be understood and acted upon quickly. That changed training priorities, deployment strategies, and even how success was defined in certain units. The limitations remained. Language was never perfect. Misinterpretations still happened. Cultural nuances could be missed. Dialects could cause confusion. There were moments where actions based on incomplete understanding led to incorrect conclusions. These were acknowledged, reviewed, and used to refine procedures. The system wasn't flawless, but it was adaptive. And that adaptability mattered, because the environment itself was constantly changing. Tribal dynamics shifted. Alliances formed and dissolved. External pressures influenced behavior. No single method, technical, linguistic, or otherwise, could fully capture that complexity on its own. But together they could approach it. Language didn't replace intelligence systems. It complemented them. It filled gaps that other systems couldn't reach. It added context, where data alone was insufficient. And most importantly, it operated at the same speed as the moment it was needed. By the end of the period, the role of language in operations had become more widely recognized, not as a replacement for existing capabilities, but as a critical component of them. It demonstrated that understanding the human element of conflict could provide advantages that pure technology alone could not achieve. In Helmand, that understanding translated into something simple but powerful: timing. The ability to hear something, understand it, and act before the opportunity passed. Because in that environment, opportunities were fleeting. Targets moved, networks adapted, situations evolved rapidly, and the side that could recognize and respond to those changes first consistently held the advantage. The British approach didn't rely on overwhelming force. It relied on awareness, on listening closely, on recognizing what others overlooked, and on acting decisively when it mattered. In the end, the war wasn't defined by a single capability. It was defined by the interaction of many. But within that interaction, language proved to be more than just a tool for communication. It became a way to see. And in a conflict where seeing clearly often meant the difference between success and failure, that made all the difference.